I personally live with borderline personality disorder. Some folks are calling it emotionally unstable personality disorder these days. But I lived with BPD myself for at least the first 35 years of my life, completely unaware that I had it. Then I suffered a major life crisis, which gave me really no other choice but to begin seriously looking inward. And that's when I realized that not only was I unhealthy, but more specifically, that I had a nameable disorder. That was really shocking to me to discover that I had lived all my life with this nameable disorder, completely unaware. Fortunately for me, I had never heard of things like borderline personality disorder before. I hadn't heard of it in pop culture. If I had, it just went right over my head. And I'd never heard it taught. I'd never entertained interest in learning or studying about psychology or emotional health or anything like that. So when my eyes were open to the fact that I was living with this thing called borderline personality disorder, and that I had always lived with it, the first thing that came to my mind was, well, I'm going to figure out the fundamental causes of this thing, and I'm just going to rid myself of it once and for all. And I was successful at this. It took me about 7 years of seriously analyzing emotional disorders in general, and the specifics related to my life, my family life growing up, my relationships, those sorts of things. But in time, I did successfully rid myself completely of borderline personality disorder, and I've been living for quite some time now perfectly healthy, emotionally speaking, authentically free of any emotional disorders. Why do I say that I was fortunate for never having heard of things like borderline personality disorder before? The reason I was fortunate is that the vast majority of all the quote-unquote experts tell you that things like borderline personality disorder and borderline personality disorder itself are incurable, that there is much a part of you as the color of your eyes. Literally, this is what the quote-unquote experts teach people. They tell you that it is interwoven into your genetic makeup. So since it's part of what you inescapably are, the best you should strive for is to learn to live with these disorders for the rest of your life and just commit some coping techniques to memory. The problem with this, when it comes to emotional disorders, is that this type of approach does nothing whatsoever to address the underlying causes of why a person is unhealthy to begin with. So let's say that you can constrain yourself from manifesting any of the symptoms of this emotional disorder, whatever emotional disorder we might be talking about. Let's say that you can constrain yourself from exhibiting those symptoms, but you haven't addressed the underlying problem. It's still there. It's still making you unhealthy and miserable, and it's going to come out in other ways. I think about a person who plugs a dam with their finger, and then the rest of the dam starts to give away because you've plugged the one escape that the tremendous pressure behind that dam had to escape. You plug that up, the pressure hasn't gone anywhere. So it's still there, and that's the way people are too. And that's the problem with the professional community focusing on symptoms. Maybe your therapist has even said that there's nothing abnormal about you and has led you to believe that everything you're dealing with is just normal human behavior. Well, these sorts of therapists, and they make up the majority, I'm sorry to say, don't deserve the clothes on their backs. They really don't, because they're not earning their living. What they're doing is they're defrauding people for a living. And it really demonstrates their complete and utter lack of genuine understanding and insight about what emotional health is, what emotional disorders are and what sets them apart from what is just normal everyday issues involving the human condition. So imagine that. The entire reason that their jobs exist at all, and they can't even live up to the fundamentals of it. And like I say, it's unfortunate that I have to say that they make that type of therapist makes up the majority, but they do. There are some great therapists out there, but you really got to search for them. So because I was never exposed early on to these lies about borderline personality disorder being incurable, and the lies that my emotional disorder is an inseparable part of me, I didn't start out working with these completely false premises. This reminds me of a famous study that was done on school-age children. So what they did was they took mediocre students in grade school, I think, and they started telling them that they were gifted. Wow, you're gifted. Your IQ is off the charts. And every interaction that they had with these kids was of the same nature as the interactions that they would have with truly gifted students. Guess what happened? All of the mediocre students' grades shot up drastically for real, just by the teachers, these figures of authority, telling them that they were really smart. Mediocre students began demonstrating really high levels of intelligence for real. Does that work the other way around too? Yes, it does. Think about poor communities and abusive homes where children are raised being led to believe that their options are limited to a really small, narrow assortment of choices. In the vast majority of cases, it doesn't even occur to these children, even as they grow older, that there is no limit there. Their limit is imaginary. That they're constraining themselves to those limits, but the limits aren't real. It doesn't even occur to most of these children to aim higher. So people born in certain conditions, in most cases, they just remain in those conditions because they've come from families and from environments and neighborhoods where everybody says you can't be anything greater than this, and so then they don't aim for anything higher than that. Sure, you've heard of the elephant illustration, you've seen a meme of it or something, or heard of it somewhere along the way, but it's where these giant circus elephants can be restrained by just a single little cord. They just wrap a tiny little cord around their ankle, put it in stick a post in the ground, and it keeps the giant, massive elephant there in place. Why? Because when they were baby elephants, they were restrained by that same rope, which at the time they couldn't break. So now, as adults, it don't even occur to them that they can just snap that rope without any effort whatsoever. It never even occurs to them to try. So thank goodness that early on in my authentic recovery from borderline personality disorder, I had not been indoctrinated by the professional community or by popular culture to view borderline personality disorder as something that was incurable. Because there's a very good chance that if I had been indoctrinated that way, that this thinking is what I would have limited myself to. So as it happened, I did my work over 7 years on the premise that borderline personality disorder was something that could be understood and resolved completely. And that's exactly what the truth proved to be.